Hey everyone, today's guest is Kamil Pabis, who's a grad student in Brian Kennedy's lab at the Center for Healthy Longevity at the National University of Singapore. Today, Kamil is going to go through his recently published paper that identified a 900-day rule when looking at lifespan studies. So if your controls don't live longer than 900 days, what are we even looking at? So with that, welcome Kamil, and let's get into the presentation.
All right, thank you. All right, as just mentioned, the idea is that lifespans of your control mice impact the interpretation of the research we're doing with mice. And this is research that I recently published here at the Center for Healthy Longevity in Singapore. I'm working in the Brian Kennedy lab, and we also had a few other collaborators in this paper, and it's actually cool maybe to give you sort of the background story how this whole thing came to be. So 10 to 15 years ago, I read Ending Aging by Aubrey de Grey. I started reading his co-author, Michael Ray, right? And he explained, you know, control mice need to be really long-lived for studies to be solid. And ever since then, we both have been obsessing about how to run good mouse lifespan studies and how people get away with publishing things and not being honest about the limitations, which is an issue, right? And then I moved to Singapore to finish my grad studies. I noticed that recently Matt Caberlain, he started also posting online about this topic, and I reached out if we could write together a manuscript, an opinion piece on this. So these were the beginnings. And when we started writing, my colleague Diogo joined, and he suggested I already had the manuscript drafted. He was like, why not call it the 900-day rule? And I thought, wow, this is perfect description. I love it. And so this is how the paper came to be. And let me click here. I will walk you through the basic first, because they're very important. The paper is often misunderstood. We will talk how long mice should live and what can we do with this knowledge once we have like defined certain benchmarks. And how can we design better mouse lifespan studies and find good drugs to slow aging. So maybe if we translate it in human terms, it's easier to understand. If you compare these three countries, they will have different life expectancies. So in Nigeria, it is rather low, probably driven by poverty, infectious disease, premature mortality. Would you say that people in Nigeria age faster than in the US? This is very unlikely. Now in the US, we have lifespans around 77 years. This is still very low for developed nations, and this is driven by drug-related deaths, the obesity epidemic. So if you compare the US to Singapore, for example, you see in Singapore people are much healthier, so they live much closer to the biological limit of humans, and they're more likely to die from age-related diseases. And if you were to extend the lifespan of a Singaporean population, this would be much more impressive and probably related to longevity. But even here, it's not perfect. There is a very high salt consumption, and you could perhaps slightly improve the lifespan by just reducing premature mortality from cardiovascular disease. So I think this is an interesting way of putting it in human terms. And you can also think about it another way. There are millions of ways to harm a mouse, to kill it in some sort of premature way. But there's only one way for a mouse to be really, really long-lived, and that is by slowing aging. And we see this, so this is more like a theoretical figure. There is a sort of biological limit that is species and strain specific for lifespan. And if you have really good husbandry, then your survival curves change in shape. And this cohort of animals or humans tends to die closer to the species-specific optimal median lifespan. And often at this point, the population starts dying really quickly. So morbidity is also compressed and the survival curve is of a more rectangular shape, as we say. And this is not just theoretical, we see this in mice, but I think it's most beautifully illustrated in human data. So as child mortality decreased and other health interventions improved, human survival curves became more rectangular, and we're inching closer towards our sort of species-specific maximum. And we just thought the same should be true for mice, given what we know about biogerontology. And only if you study these really long-lived mice will you get solid results. And this was the theoretical side. We also looked at real data. So whenever you run experiments in multiple mouse cohorts, you give them some sort of intervention or treatment. It can be anything. You will notice that the longer-lived cohorts respond less well to the life extension treatment, usually, almost always. And for example, this was pretty clear in this classical study published over 10 years ago, where caloric restriction was imposed in this ILS cross ISS strain. So it was basically almost obvious from this initial publication, if you look at the raw data from this original paper. And I thought, since this was a very controversial paper, I want to reanalyze it. Maybe we can learn something new. So I looked at this data and I looked at other large calorie restriction experiments performed across various species. So we have now these large experiments where many strains of flies, many strains of worms and yeast were exposed to caloric restriction, and then researchers checked how they respond, how their lifespan changes in response to caloric restriction. And when you plotted the animals that were already long-lived in the beginning, you notice they respond much less to caloric restriction. Sometimes even caloric restriction is harmful in these, whereas the bottom survivors, the least fortunate members of those strains, they respond the best to caloric restriction. Now, this could be a counter argument that caloric restriction maybe won't work in really healthy species or humans. But there is one problem, that you could see the same pattern in the data for purely statistical reasons. So this is something we wanted to correct for. There is a really pervasive statistical artifact called regression to the mean. It affects literally any kind of study, even controlled trials. And I think it's very cool to explain it using 3 examples. Let's say you were to recruit people with depression for a controlled trial. They will usually in the beginning present with higher than average depression scores, and then they will converge towards some sort of median value because there was some depression cutoff in your recruitment criteria. So this induced regression to the mean. Or if you throw coins and you throw a certain side 4 times in a row, then the next 4 coin throws, they will still have a 50-50 chance each, but the average value of them will converge towards the mean expected value. Now, the same is true if you were to look at multiple cohorts of mice with lifespans. Let's say they have the 900-day mean lifespan. Maybe for some reason you sampled 50 mice that had an 800-day mean lifespan just by chance. Now, the next cohort you will sample is more likely to be closer to the 900 days, and this can induce a lot of interesting, weird artifacts. And without going into detail, we tried to adjust for it. So this is one of those studies where lifespan is plotted on the x-axis and the benefit to caloric restriction is plotted on the y-axis. So these are those Ilksis mice exposed to caloric restriction. It seems like the longer-lived animals respond less well. But we wanted to correct for this regression to the mean artifact, sort of assuming, put in the simplest terms, that from the control group you can derive a sort of distribution and then pretend that we're treated with placebo, and what would you expect in this synthetic experiment, which is plotted here in blue. And you see in the synthetic experiment, you still get regression to the mean. Now the question for me, I think, is the result that we see in those pink, with those pink dots, even more pronounced than the one that is expected based on purely regression to the mean. And then the interpretation of this is that even adjusting for this statistical artifact, these caloric restricted mice, the longer lived ones responded less well to the intervention. We also see this in flies and worms. So there are 2 large experiments where we saw, or the authors saw, that caloric restriction taken in total does extend lifespan of multiple strains. But again, the longer lived strains responded less well. And here you can also briefly note that the patterns of the regression to the mean look different, because if you have very large sample sizes, you're less likely to encounter regression to the mean. And for example, this fly experiment shown at the top was run with very large group sizes, the bottom experiment with very small group sizes. So generally with small group sizes, you get much more pronounced regression to the mean. And this is always something that you have to account for in one way or another in these large multi-cohort studies. And having established that lifespans are important, we ask, like, how long should a mouse live? And then, strictly speaking, in the paper, we mostly talk about black 6 mice and het 3 mice, the two most popular strains currently in longevity. And if you plot data from many other studies, different meta-analysis, you will notice that lifespans vary quite a lot, but the most elite survivors, they tend to top out around 900 days in that range for black 6 mice and het 3 mice. So we thought the natural limit for black 6 mice is around 900 days based on this. However, as was correctly pointed out by colleagues, of course, this can be very strain specific, so this conclusion may not hold for other strains. So there are other very commonly used strains that are much shorter lived. So in my opinion, those strains might be less robust than black 6 mice, but there are actually even strains which are longer lived. Theoretically, maybe they're even better models of aging than black 6 mice. However, in the paper, we really wanted to define a benchmark of how long should these black 6 and het 3 mice live under the best circumstances. And this is what we call the 900-day rule. Once you pull the data, you see that in the best case, they live around 900 days. And from this, we can then conclude, if you run a study and your control mice do reach this lifespan, then your results will be more robust. But even failing this, right, if you got unlucky and your control mice are short-lived, maybe your intervention is still very robust and it leads to a lifespan much higher than 950 days. This is still extremely unusual. And this still suggests that your intervention is probably working and somehow beneficial. So you compare it to historical controls. And some people wondered, is maybe 900 days too high, too stringent? How do different labs perform? I don't want to, single out anyone as a bad lab, because that's not how it works. Sometimes people get unlucky. We cannot fully control mouse lifespans, as I will explain in the second part of the talk. But here I just want to plot data from some colleagues who consistently run like really amazing mouse lifespan studies. And you can see that they get like consistent lifespans. So lifespans are often very consistent within facilities and labs. So Alan Richardson, we already discussed, my colleague Marco Malavolta from Italy, for example. The ITP gets amazing lifespans for the female het 3 mice. So it's possible. Let me say that. And now that we know, how long do we think these mice should live in the best case, can we apply this knowledge to re-rank interventions? And this is actually more important than people think, because by now we have hundreds of potential interventions that have some efficacy, but not all studies are created equal. Some of those studies are relatively weak because the lifespans are short and the controls and other issues. And here we looked at 3 interventions. So the lifespan is plotted on the y-axis, the historical controls are on the left, and we look at telomerase, rapamycin, and metformin. And for telomerase, you can see that exposed mice have higher lifespans. For rapamycin, as is known in the literature, they also live longer. And by our benchmark, these mice are longer lived than you would expect. They reach lifespans at the top end and far above the top end of what you would expect. So this nicely fits with our 900-day rule. And then metformin we chose as a sort of negative control, because recently people have shown that it just doesn't do anything in mice. When you pool the data, there is a non-significant tiny improvement in lifespan. But even if this was real, the absolute lifespan is so low and the controls are so short-lived in those metformin studies that the data is just not robust. However, that does not mean that metformin cannot be healthy either in humans or mice. So in theory, there can be longevity extending or longevity normalizing interventions, as we call them. So longevity normalizing would be the ones that can work in a sort of unhealthy cohort that suffers from premature mortality. They can help the cohort reach the natural lifespan. Could be, for example, statins in people with hyperlipidemia, metformin in people who are slightly overweight, I don't know, something like that. And longevity extending are like rapamycin that really help you beat the biological limit of lifespan. And we can go back, for example, to drug age and re-rank compounds, look at the most promising of those. So we did this, and you see some classical things like deprenyl, which was in the 90s probably the best studied and most robust intervention before the existence of rapamycin and EGA. And maybe it's perhaps nicer to plot them the way we did it in the paper with absolute lifespan. So how long do the mice live when you expose them to all those different drugs? And it's very interesting. For example, you can see that this NDGA is towards the top. So these mice were long-lived in the drug age database, and this drug was also somewhat successful in the interventions testing program, which we think is related to the fact that it already worked in long-lived mice, so that suggests it's a robust intervention. Interestingly, nebivolol was in drug age, it works in long-lived mice, but while our article was in press and in revision, I think it failed in the ITP. So you can see that you can never fully predict results. Just because it works in one long-lived mouse strain doesn't mean it will work in another one. And this is very cool. The interventions testing program will test deprenil in an ongoing cohort. So we will see if this will be robust. We would predict that it should be a robust finding that can replicate in the interventions testing program because it used to work in other long-lived strains. You can also look at genetic interventions and re-rank them to find the most promising things. So as is known, we find that the best models tend to be those that have mutations in some sort of growth hormone signaling pathway. But we also find that some of the top genetic mutants use different mechanisms. So there are the SIRT6 overexpressing mice, telomerase overexpressing mice. So these are very cool alternative mechanisms that still yield very, very long lifespans in the treated groups, unusually long lifespans. And I think these are very cool candidates to follow up. So this is one thing you can do with the 900-day rule. I think these two, ACT2 and FGF21, among the growth and nutrient signaling pathways are very interesting. They're still quite understudied, although they lead to really amazingly long-lived mice when you knock out ACT2 or overexpress FGF21. Then what else can you do? So one question that we were asked, is the rule, does it have predictive power? Does it work for other interventions? So we looked at classical interventions, rapamycin, caloric restriction, dwarfism, and we basically checked how many studies where these interventions were studied past the 900-day rule. And you can see that sort of for the positive controls, a lot of the studies passed the 900-day rule, but for metformin, they basically don't. And we generally show that the robust interventions that we know are the gold standards, they tend to work, as you can see in this figure B, in studies where the controls were already long-lived, and they further extend the lifespan of those long-lived controls, which suggests they're highly robust, whereas something like metformin is not. And I think it's very cool to look at the dwarf data plotted like that in absolute terms to see just how amazingly long-lived these animals are. And in gray, we always plot this historical control. So the 900-day benchmark, you can see that the dwarf mice are so much longer lived. And this is what we expect from a robust intervention. That's how it should look when you start pooling data across different studies. Another thing to sort of validate the 900-day rule is you can look at, I already mentioned the interventions testing program, which is a large, very robust, very rigorous mouse lifespan testing program, perhaps the best in the world. And we always ask, as researchers, will the compound replicate in the interventions testing program? Will it also work there? And we can look at non-ITP studies where there's success in those studies, predicted success in the ITP study. And we see for compounds like NDGA or rapamycin, these worked in non-ITP studies. They passed the 900-day rule in non-ITP studies, and they also worked in ITP studies, whereas some other compounds, aspirin, NAD boosters, curcumin, they were tested in the interventions testing program, they failed. But when they were tested in other mouse models, they only extended lifespan in short-lived animals. So we do think that the rule is able, on average, to predict more robust compounds that will work in different strains. And to give a brief update, this year was amazing in terms of the 900-day rule. There were 3 different papers published with approaches where the controls were very long-lived and you got further lifespan extension. So here's a figure from Matt Kabeline on the recent IL-11 antagonist antibody. This one extends, for example, lifespan in long-lived against long-lived controls, the trametinib combination group, and a certain polyphenol test that also works. So I have hope for the field that we're moving forward to getting a lot of robust studies. And this is indeed what we observed in the paper, right? If you plot the studies published over the last 100 years and the lifespans of control animals in those studies, you see that there was a turning point around the 1980s studies. The lifespan started really improving. Before they were quite low. Now we're getting closer to having 850, 900 day lifespans in studies with a lot of variability. We hope we can further improve this, and this will make future studies more robust, but there are certainly a lot of studies that already meet this benchmark. And this is unpublished data just for you. So we actually see the same trend in rats. So our rat husbandry also improved, and interestingly, most rat strains also kind of top out around 900 days. So you can use this 900 day rule of thumb also to look at rat studies in general. Now, what are the implications? How can we make lifespan studies even better? This is very important now, of course. So it has been suggested that your mice should be really healthy. They should have a healthy weight, maybe even induce mild caloric restriction in the control. Mice have to be kept in a low stress environment. They're very sensitive to smells. They can even smell human hormones. They can smell blood of other mice. So that's very important. People keep their mice in specific pathogen-free facilities these days, but I've actually found that certain labs can also get great lifespans in non-SPF facilities as long as they're clean and reasonable. There are other tricks. We have to work on standardization within and between facilities. We have to make sure that our euthanasia guidelines are reasonable. So some people are concerned that veterinarians are starting to euthanize mice too early when they show the earliest signs of discomfort, which, if you ask me, is ethically slightly questionable. There needs to be a balance. Just because someone is pain doesn't mean they desire to be euthanized. So treatment should go before euthanasia so that mice can live as healthy and as long as possible. So there are a lot of factors that can be optimized without going into details to improve mouse lifespan studies. And as stated before, there's a lot of unpredictability. We don't have full control over how the lifespan studies goes. We don't fully understand why the lifespans vary so much. However, once we, editors, readers, realize that lifespans are important, we can start rewarding success. We can, give certain advantages to papers that have simply better controls, and then there naturally will be competition to publish papers with better control lifespans once we start paying attention to this. And of course, even if you have short-lived mice, this doesn't mean the data is worthless. So different strains, they offer genetic diversity. This can be important, testing in diverse strains, even if they are slightly shorter lived. And other factors also matter in designing a great mouse study. Lifespans of the controls are not the end all. So to sum up what I said, basically the 900-day rule is important. We think the longer mice live, the better, and 900 days is a very good cutoff for very healthy black 6 and het-free mice. Still, it's a rule of thumb. It's not a super hard rule. It gives you a strong intuition. And I think it's a good intuition. There are other arbitrary cutoffs. If you look at it, for example, p-values, there is no reason why 0.05 is the border to significance. There is nothing fundamentally different between 0.04 and 0.06 except a tiny difference. It was just chosen through historical accident. And also what I really love about this 900-day rule is you can actually nicely translate it to humans. If you look at around, divide the lifespan of those black 6 mice by 10 in days, that's the lifespan that humans are roughly reaching in years. And I think our lifespan is also converging towards 90 years. I think this is close to the biological limit that humans will reach without extending our lifespan and slowing aging. And yeah, all studies are important. We should not, not publish studies that fail the 900-day rules. We don't want any publication bias. We need to look at various genetically diverse mice. And now what are the next steps for me or for the lab? We want to raise awareness how to run good studies. We want to develop these rules also for invertebrate studies because we think the same thing is happening there. And then we want to identify promising interventions, test them in invertebrates to see if they target perhaps evolutionary conserved mechanisms, and then design new and better studies. And yeah, thanks for listening. Thanks to the team in Singapore, our funders, NUS, VitaDAO.
Did you look at maximal lifespans using a similar approach, not a 900-day rule, but maybe 11 or 1200 days?
So maximal lifespans, we did not look a lot at it for two reasons. They are statistically harder to estimate as the sample sizes get lower when the mice are older. They are slightly less intuitive, and we think when the mice are healthy, the median lifespan is generally a good predictor of the maximal lifespan, but I do agree in principle, maximal lifespan is a slightly better readout for slowing the rate of aging.
Yeah, even if it's not a readout for the rate of aging, just seeing, like you said, just because you get that increase in median lifespan, you would assume that there's an increase in maximal lifespan, but in many studies, that's not the case, so the survival curves just basically flatline off and everybody dies at that same point, right? So, yeah, all right. And then another factor too is sample size. So did you have a sample size cutoff? Because some studies, that'll post, even with relatively short-lived controls, they'll have initial sample sizes, per group of like 8 mice per group, which independent of the, maybe the controls are short-lived. Now you've got a 8 versus 8 survival study, which I don't know how instructive that is when compared with some of the ITP or other labs that are using, 50, 60, 70 mice per group, which has a greater power. So did you exclude some studies or not based on initial sample size per group?
So we did not exclude studies based on sample size. I looked at the data with and without correcting for sample sizes. And so, for example, the median lifespans reported for Black 6 mice. I looked at the huge cohorts and some smaller studies, and they were clustering in a similar range. But you're right, if the sample size is small, you're much more likely to get outliers, and that's not preferable. You want to have like maybe 30 to 50 mice at least for a single rigorous study. But sometimes there are these experiments like this caloric restriction on the ILS cross, right? So it's 40 cohorts. Each cohort is very small, but taken together, it was a big experiment. But that's what the authors had to work with because of funding issues. So
Yeah. And then when the Richardson group tried to replicate the Laos, right? Their group, Richardson's group wasn't able to replicate those findings. I think in 6 of the 8 strains that they tested, calorie restriction still worked, which was like, so what are your thoughts on that disparity?
it's very complex. So I looked at this, and what definitely does not replicate between different ILCSIS studies is the magnitude of lifespan extension under caloric restriction. But the control lifespans, they do replicate. There is variability, but we know that these do replicate. And this is a lot of strange, interesting conclusions. But as you say, Aller and Richardson found a more positive interpretation. But it's very amazing that the degree of caloric restriction does not fully replicate. This is
Strain dependent, right? So it depends on the strain for calorie restriction in mice, the magnitude of the CR potentially impacting lifespan, right? So some studies show better effects at 20% relative to 40%. So too much restriction may be bad. So did you factor that in for the CR studies, or the CR was just any restriction, not necessarily 10, 20, all in one group?
Yeah, so our main analysis was on this initial ILCSIS study where there was a fixed level of caloric restriction. So all the mice get the same restriction. This is the only one that has really sufficiently large sample sizes to do a forest statistical analysis on. And when you start pulling data, there are these meta-analysis of caloric restriction studies. It gets extremely heterogeneous and it's much harder to draw conclusions.
So I also saw a study that They did CR, fasting duration plus circadian alignment. I don't know if you, I didn't see that in the included list, where, and I forgot the authors, but, so circadian alignment being that they fed the mice during nighttime, not during the daytime, and that actually extended lifespan more than CR plus fasting. So any thoughts on that? And if I remember correctly, it was the CR plus fasting was greater than CR in terms of the 900-day rule, and circadian alignment was even better. It was like 1,050. So I didn't see that study included either. So just maybe some nuance. What do you think? Like, it's not just pure CR, but maybe getting the fasting window and other factors.
Yeah, this is quite a recent study, and it's part of these studies trying to disaggregate the benefits of calorie restriction. This is one, and the other one is where it was shown that the fasting window is a partial contributor to the benefits of calorie restriction, but the calories itself are also an independent contributor. And then there is also the alignment issue. So all those three seem to affect mouse lifespan. So yeah, these three factors seem to play a role.
Yeah, additive relative to
Yes,
CR alone. Yeah. So
it seems so.
yeah. So if you put that in the interventions that beat the 900-day rule, right? So just to recap, CR, telomerase, rapamycin, and the growth hormone knockouts, right? So I wonder how that compares. I mean, that probably would put CR at a closer magnitude to the other studies that seem to be better in terms of more robust median lifespan extension.
Yes, but I think so, according to Matt, and I think this is true, the study with the largest lifespan extension is still one of those old studies where they had like a very severe level of caloric restriction, 50 around percent, and no one so far has beaten the absolute lifespan of this cohort. Maybe one day using fasting and some sort of alignment and maybe something else we will beat it, but so far we have not managed to beat this old study for some reason.
Yeah. All right. And then diets across studies is not always the same. So um, I guess that wasn't a factor. That was just, what lifespan do you have in the study that you're conducting? Because if you're using a purified diet versus, purified high-fat diet versus standard chow, you'll see differences in lifespan. So factor or not diet?
Yeah, I'm not sure if purified versus non-purified affects lifespan and also the macronutrient composition. Like people have studied it for 30 plus years and it does play a small role. But so, for example, protein restriction has a much smaller impact than caloric restriction, but certainly the macronutrient composition can play a role. So the control lifespan could vary according to this somewhat. But within reasonable bounds, when you pool the literature data, it seems to often converge towards 900 days. So maybe some labs, have found the magic formula which makes them even more longer lived. Maybe slightly slows the intrinsic rate of aging.
Gotcha. Wait, so now that opens up a whole can of worms, right? So protein restriction, right? So methionine restriction, was that included in the analysis? I don't remember seeing.
No, and those extreme single amino acid imbalances have massive impacts on lifespan. But so far for protein restriction in total, it does not seem to work that well. And the variation within regular rodent chow is not huge, but like the BCA and protein and methionine restriction tend to have pretty substantial effects. Yes.
Yeah. So how would methionine restriction compare in that small group of interventions that consistently beat the 900-day rule?
I looked at this for a while ago, and there are actually not as many studies as I hoped. But I think among all the amino acid restrictions, it's the most robust one, with the most studies backing it up. But I can't recall how many of those studies actually beat the 900-day rule.
Gotcha. And then in terms of the purified diet not impacting lifespan or not extending it. So there is at least one study where a keto diet, so it was purified, very high fat, and it extended lifespan, or median lifespan. I don't remember in terms of the 900-day rule. I'll have to take a look, but because high fat diets will lead to it's obesogenic, right? So which can shorten lifespan. So they had to feed the mice a specific amount of food in order to get that lifespan extension to make sure that they didn't overeat. So I guess that study, that keto extends lifespan study, that wasn't included either, or I'll have to go back, I guess, and take a look and see.
I don't recall the details, but I know that I looked at all the keto studies in mice. I think there is more than one now, and I was not impressed by the lifespan benefits, either in terms of control lifespan or the size of the effect. So compared to caloric restriction, it was not impressive at all, so I didn't look much further. It can have benefits under certain circumstances, but for lifespan, it was not super impressive.
I think it's important to highlight what has worked generally in the shorter lived models, but not beating the 900-day rule, which some of these supplements are very popular in the anti-aging, circles like berberine, alpha-ketoglutarate, as you mentioned, metformin. So if you're getting an increase in lifespan in a short-lived strain, could you argue that maybe when considering that most of the at least American population is, becoming more overweight and obese, quote unquote, unhealthy phenotype, if for these molecules that are extending lifespan in relatively short-lived strains, right? Could you argue that the people that are in an unhealthy phenotype could benefit the most from some of these supplements?
Yeah, I think that's plausible. And it's also the realm of medicine. That's what they try to do. They try to find a target population which is sick and then normalize their lifespan. So that's what metformin can beautifully do in pre-diabetes.
Right. But then the question
And
is, yep.
for the berberine and AKG, I mean, I also thought a bit about this. So I think we have still very few studies to say whether they really consistently failed the 900-day rule. AKG was going to be retested once again in the ITP at an earlier onset, so we will learn more about it. But so far, the data was not very impressive, and maybe they're like, longevity normalizing, helpful if you have some disease state.
Yeah. But in terms of, so people who are generally healthy then, so sticking to that small window, well, granted, it's only basically two interventions. Well, I don't know that, so there are some telomerase activators, right? I don't know that they're the same as what was used in the published studies, but rapamycin CR, telomerase, and then I don't know how you would, reduce, I mean, or interventions that would reduce growth hormone signaling, right? In people, that would be the gold standard in terms of what quote unquote healthy people could potentially impact human longevity.
Right. I mean, the list in our paper wasn't fully exhaustive. I mean, there are a lot of interesting interventions. And the problem is, if you look at all the weak interventions, you end up with dozens, 50 plus, and then you're popping all those random pills based on really, really, really weak mouse studies. And I think using the 900-day rule to draw a line and then combine it with human clinical data is the wise choice to pre-select your supplements. So recently, also not in the paper, I think because it's a new paper, I was somewhat positive about the taurine work because there the mice were nicely long-lived. So that would be perhaps over berberine. I would choose taurine if I had to choose them, based on preliminary data.
Yeah, but what about more specificity, right? So let's say you're in a quote unquote healthy BMI, but you could be metabolically unhealthy, right? It's this, skinny fat phenotype, right? So what do you think about using biomarkers and then, a targeted approach? For example, circulating levels of glucose increase during aging. Acarbose in that case would limit how much glucose would be absorbed, potentially reducing circulating levels, potentially improving metabolic health and lifespan. So in that case, for someone who's metabolically quote unquote unhealthy and doesn't want to change their diet, acarbose would have a specific role that also could potentially impact lifespan. Whereas most people are seeing the animal studies and they're like, oh, this extended lifespan, like you said, I'm going to take 50 pills. But what do you think about using a biomarker driven approach, even in the mice, right? So the mice at an older age maybe have poor kidney function. Let's give them a supplement that improves kidney function. And, they have some fungal infection. Rapamycin could be beneficial in that case, right? So what do you think about using a biomarker-driven approach in people to dictate which supplements, even using some of the animal data, right, as instructive, but what do you think about it? You could even apply that towards the mice where, um, you know, identifying the short-lived strains based on biological age or epigenetics, whatever it may be. So how do you integrate biomarkers in this to have a more specific supplemental approach for optimizing health and lifespan?
Yeah, I think you should, absolutely. This is like what we're doing with the modern sort of longevity clinics. They try to go into real preventative medicine, sort of at the border between geroscience and medicine. I don't think it's true geroscience yet because many of these compounds probably don't slow aging, but if you pick the right one, they might add a lot of healthy years to your life. As you say, if you have some problem and you can diagnose it and target it, that's smart. but ultimately due to Teuber's paradox, right? If you do not slow all causes of aging, you will hit the biological limit no matter what, relatively soon.
Right. It's just a matter of identifying which compound would be best for that individual's genetic background, but then using objective data like the biomarkers to try to target which of the supplements would be best, right?
I think there's promise there, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So now translating it to people, right? So even though rapamycin is basically the best pharmacological intervention for extending at least mouse lifespan, what are your thoughts of two prominent rapamycin long-term users dying and either Blagostoni died, I think 64, brain cancer just recently, and Alan Green made it to I think 80-ish, right? So one made it to below average lifespan and the other around the average, maybe a little bit above average.
Yeah, it's pretty tragic. And the optics obviously don't look good, but we do have to consider that right now thousands of people are taking rapamycin, and the magic is in the statistics. If it really slows longevity, so the estimate from mice for me was around 10% after pooling, that is very difficult to measure with a sample size of a handful of people.
Yeah.
It also extends lifespan in marmosets around 10%, and here we have 30, 50, 60 animals. So you wanna really look at the numbers because the magnitude of the effect will not be large enough to really see, I took rapamycin, I should live to 95, it's
Yeah, for sure. An anecdote of two people, like you said, versus a population of thousands, it's a big difference, right? Uh, but biomarkers, right? I'm still trying to figure out which biomarkers, rapamycin improves. Like if you can pick, I mean, so for me, I think it may, even though you get it past the 900-day rule and it's not extending lifespan in a short-lived strain, um, when considering it can suppress the immune system, like, are we getting, an improvement of like, I still don't get in terms of rapamycin, what it's actually improving to potentially increase lifespan.
we have overall a lack of biomarkers in geroscience, and it's highly problematic. The same can be said for intermittent fasting, right? Maybe it does something. It does not seem to improve cardiometabolic health. Maybe it boosts autophagy, but how do you measure this? We have no good non-invasive biomarkers to prove which is a plausible mechanism. Same for rapamycin. Preclinical data suggests it should, you know, promote translational fidelity, improve autophagy, but these things are very hard to measure in humans.
Yeah, you'd expect to see it somewhere though, right? Biomarkers of kidney, liver, immune cells, inflammation, glucose. I mean, if none of those, I think there's one study, I forgot the lead author, but it was like a small trial of rapamycin and they looked at biomarker changes before and after. And it was basically almost nothing, so.
I don't know if you followed the Pearl trial. So recently they published the outcome, and visceral fat, I think, seemed to be the most promising thing changing with rapamycin. And maybe we'll see CRP in larger studies and some sort of inflammation signal.
Yeah, so that gets to you put in the supplementary data, the healthy fatness model. So yeah, can you expand on that?
It is a strange quirk of mice, so maybe their fat metabolism is not a perfect model for humans, or maybe there's actually something happening there. So some of these dwarfs, they're literally obese. They have really high body fat percentage, but their fat tends to be reprogrammed to be less inflammatory and even secrete like beneficial cytokines. And the same was true in this Ilkes cross. For some reason, I think the mice with a higher body fat percentage tended to survive better, and maintaining this body fat was a marker of better survival. But as you mentioned in your mail to me, right, it could be a distinction between visceral and subcutaneous fat because the subcutaneous might be beneficial, especially in these special states.
Yeah, and visceral fat removal, at least in rats, with only one study. I mean,
Yes.
there aren't any replications, so extends lifespan. But so I looked into the Furco mice. Are you familiar with the fat insulin receptor knockout mice?
I didn't look much into it.
Yeah, so that extends lifespan too. And so I wanted to see, okay, is it visceral or subcutaneous? And, the hypothesis would be it's probably reducing visceral, and that's why they live longer, but nobody's looked at that either, right? So um, it, that could be, I don't know, along the lines of your rapamycin, that could, if rapamycin is reducing visceral fat, that could be a big deal that nobody's thinking about, which then goes to the idea of the standards, right? Eat less, be lean, regular exercise training, minimize visceral fat as a potential pro-longevity approach in people.
Yeah, that's a good thought.
So how has this study changed your supplemental approach? Like what you supplement with, if you supplement with anything?
Well, I always followed the basic guidelines of this manuscript, right? So my idea was always to look at the best quality mouse data, pre-select compounds, and then to do an intersection. Take these compounds and see if they have some interesting human data. It can be a surrogate endpoint, it can be clinical data, and then choose the ones that might slow aging and have some human data. So I like taurine because it has some moderate evidence on blood pressure and it slows aging in at least one study, for example. So I think it can inform if you're like a biohacker, you like self-experimentation. I think this is great.
So you're only supplementing with taurine right now?
Out of potential longevity drugs that meet the 900-day rule, yes. I mean, spermidine is on my short list because it performs really well in multiple studies. But I still need to be a little convinced by the human data. But for example, yeah, spermidine because of this is on my short list.
So what are your thoughts about intake versus degradation, right? So intake, you'd expect to have higher plasma levels of taurine or spermidine, but there may be many mechanisms that lead to its degradation. So for example, you could supplement with omega-3, but if you're in a pro-inflammatory state, most of that or some of that omega-3 will be degraded systemically into other metabolites. So your circulating levels of EPA and DHA may not be, quote unquote optimal or, be associated with lowest all-cause mortality risk. So intake is one side of it. So do you measure plasma levels of taurine or spermidine as one means for, targeting dose even?
I mean, the thing that I still used to measure was vitamin D, but now I use an empirical dose that is associated with very marginal benefits on cancer mortality in some studies, right? But if you could measure it reliably, these things, then it's probably a good idea, but you still want to have good prospective epidemiology or other studies suggesting what are the target levels.
Yeah.
I
Or
don't I don't do much myself.
you don't do that yet. But so defining what's optimal may be tricky. For example, plasma levels of taurine, you could go by, population-based averages, but knowing that it can decline during aging, at least seeing where your data is in youth and then trying to avoid that age-related decline, whether by more supplementation or discovering the recipe for what leads to systemic degradation. So that's actually how I see part of the story too, right? So supplementation, at least targeted, could be a part of the approach for extending average and maximal lifespan. But if you know metabolites and pathways that are key in longevity, and you know that some things are supposed to decline during aging based on the population-based averages and other things are supposed to increase. If you could discover the recipe for diet, exercise, supplements for keeping that youthful biochemical state and kind of having to avoid the parabiosis to get you to that state, I'd argue that could be an approach for extending, at least average lifespan and health span. But there's no published data. Nobody has done a long-term RCT. It has not, there's no published evidence in support of it. So what do you think about that approach?
Yeah, recently I was brainstorming about metabolomics and I had this idea, right? So you measure metabolites, how they change with aging, and you will probably find dozens, hundreds of things that change with aging. What would happen if you were not to supplement one of them and normalize one of them, perhaps just taurine, right? If you were to normalize all of these things that change with aging, like how much could you achieve in terms of benefit? It's a beautiful idea to be tested.
Yeah, so there's actually some talk about that, and I hear you on the taurine one metabolite. It's kind of like, thinking about existence as an ecosystem, right? Human and microbiome. So if you change just a weed in a giant forest, do you change the ecosystem of the giant forest, which is kind of the analogy you were going for with taurine versus all these metabolites. But if you look at like just using metabolomics, say 600 metabolites or however many can be measured currently commercially, uh, if you know what that pattern looks like in terms of metabolite classes and what it looks like in youth, technically any intervention, you can see if it shifts the global profile towards a more youthful state, independent of one metabolite, right? Technically, you can dig deeper and say, did I improve cholesterol esters or, whatever, pick your pathway of interest, right? But that's where I think the field is going, is interventions that change, the global profile, whether it's proteomics or any of the omics, towards the more youthful state rather than these independent interventions, which, maybe the weed in the forest.
Yeah, although it brings us back to the whole IGF-1 story. So, of course, a lot of things change with aging, but not all of them are maladaptive. The average sum of things that change in blood and elsewhere with aging is harmful, but some of them will probably be beneficial. So sometimes you will, if you supplement, you might end up still harming yourself. But so it would be even better if you would know which of the things that change with aging are harmful, and then just select the subset that needs to be changed and not change all of them to a youthful state, because
100% agree, right? It's evaluating the intervention contextually across all organ systems, not just, all right, if I eat a low carb, high fat diet, I improve metabolic health, but then not thinking about what's the global impact on kidney, liver, immune, et cetera. It's what's the net effect, right? But this is a limitation in academic studies because it's like we have to get funding based on very specific pathways. It's like, do you improve cardiometabolic health? And most studies aren't even looking at the rest of the picture, so it's kind of a narrow view in some ways.
yeah.
Cool. So what's next for you? What's the next study? What's your path? Finishing up the PhD after that, like where do you see your role in aging science, aging research over the next few decades?
So I'm working on one more similar paper that is sort of a theoretical paper dealing with foundations, because I'm really attracted to this kind of topic and I think it can inform the field and readers. But ultimately, I'm more interested in interventions and slowing aging really substantially. So I want to perhaps commercialize certain compounds, and we're interested in combinations, perhaps going for skin, because you can do a lot of high throughput testing in principle in skin. It's the regulatory climate is better, and I feel like there's potential there.
So skin aging, so your primary interest would be skin aging going forward?
That will be one of the things, and also others, community building, writing theoretical papers. Just I'm interested in the whole pipeline, right? Getting a supplement or product from early data to humans and beyond.
Nice. All right, wait. So with the skin approach, would that involve like testing the microbiome and skin pH, all the factors that can impact skin health during aging?
Well, it's not my expertise. I'm sure that's interesting, but so far I've not considered it.
So when you think about like the evolution of interventions, right? Right now, it's almost solely based on chemical. And although as soon as I start to mention it, it sounds like, woo, what are your thoughts on like, there is published data, but so like red light therapy, using parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, but then even in some ways sound therapy. So ultrasound therapy may be beneficial in some cases in Alzheimer's disease patients in RCTs. So now you've got these, chemical interventions, and then you've got these non-chemical interventions. So what do you think about the non-chemical interventions? I mean, granted, this isn't your work, it's just your personal opinion, but have you thought about it at all? And
Yeah, I have a short list of things that I find interesting. So some things I think are more like pleasurable and could be have like health benefits. Let's say physiotherapy, massage, yoga. So there are some weak suggestions of improved mortality which I don't fully buy, but then there is some potential in hyperbaric that I really want to see explored, and heat therapies, because the preclinical evidence is sort of promising there.
nice. And then what do you think the longevity field is slow on right now, or something that's obvious to you besides the 900-day rule? Like yeah, that you think should be, either addressed, or you just think it's comical that people aren't thinking about?
I don't know, slow. I mean, it's of course no one's fault, but we're slow on everything because we lack the funding. So we're one of the most underfunded fields. We've been slow on rapamycin for decades. Like we're just not getting any larger studies off the ground, and it's a tragedy with either rapamycin or rapalogs. I think we do pay a little bit too much attention to lifestyle interventions that indeed probably don't work in animal models. They probably just provide health span and no lifespan benefits, so we don't draw a clear line there. That's what the field is a bit slow on.
And then
So those are some of
underrated
the
as,
issues that I see.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, those are like certain issues that I see.
Yeah, nice. And so underrated aspects of uh, studying aging that most people don't know about that you think they should know about, besides things like the 900-day rule that would seem obvious to you, but maybe not so much to other people?
Right, so this is sort of the idea for my next theoretical paper that it really takes a multimodal approach, it takes multiple interventions, combinations, and that not one is, or currently, there is not one that is superior to the others. You cannot say exercise is better than vitamin D or fish oil, because if you start looking at the evidence, it breaks down and you really cannot say this. You can say that there are multiple pillars and they're all important. Sleep, exercise, healthy diet, even supplements, even drugs. People, have sometimes a very bad naturalistic fallacy type of view on drugs and supplements, but they all have a role to play. I think this is really underappreciated.
So you mentioned combination therapies. So rapamycin plus acarbose extends lifespan, and it extends lifespan more than rapamycin, if I remember correctly. And I think that data was in the paper. And there's obviously, yeah, I think the ITP did that work. So is that where you see combination therapies? I think you mentioned combination therapies being a big part of being underrated right now, and that's where the field is going to go. Which combinations may be best for further maximizing lifespan?
Yeah, it just doesn't seem plausible that you could slow aging substantially with just a single drug targeting a single well-defined pathway, so it must be going there.
So which combinations would you use other than rapamycin and acarbose, just as an example?
I feel what we're really lacking is, for example, things that promote DNA repair. We have a lot of damage removal, reduced production of damage approaches, like rapamycin might do this, but to substantially improve DNA repair would be great. And I think there are some things in the pipeline for that. And still stress resistance sort of prevent DNA damage without increasing DNA repair capacity is still a little bit underexplored, so we don't have, well, we're not quite there yet, but I think these are cool approaches so to add with rapamycin.
Are there DNA repair studies, metabolites, or supplements that you think would be best to evaluate?
And there's pretty cool work by Björn Schumacher from CCAT in Cologne on what is it, inhibitors or activators, on the dream complex, so drugs that affect the dream complex and DNA repair enzymes.
Nice, but no lifespan data on that yet.
No, none of it, not yet.
Cool. All right, so that's all I've got. I appreciate you, Kamil. Is there anything I didn't ask you that I should have asked you that is obvious?
Um, no, I think we covered quite a lot. I mean, we could go on for hours, but I think we already covered quite a nice range of topics.
Cool. Well, thanks again, Kamil, and I'm looking forward to your progress in the field, and we'll chat again soon.